They told me the old horse had gone blind 2 winters past, and that he could no longer find the water trough without a hand on his neck, and that the kindest thing left to do was to let him stand quiet in his paddock until his heart decided it had carried enough. I am the officer who gave the order to bring him to the parade ground instead. I gave it knowing it broke a dozen small rules of how a closed square is to be kept on a morning when no parade is scheduled, and I have never in 30 years of service given an order I was more certain of. His name was Sorrel, and he was 29 years old, which for a charger of the household horse is older than most men in the regiment had been alive. He had marched the King's Avenue of the Kingdom of Brensmark for 19 seasons, carrying the standard at the head of the mounted troop, and there was not a cobblestone on that long ceremonial mile his hooves had not struck in time to the regimental band. Then his eyes had clouded, first the left and then the right, and one spring the farrier had looked into them with the long lamp and said, gently, that the light in them was all but gone. They had retired him to the green paddock behind the riding school, where a boy of the stables led him out each morning and led him back each night, and where he stood for hours with his head lifted and turned, as if he were listening for something that did not come. I am telling this badly, let me tell it the way it happened. It began with the stable boy, whose name was Pell, and who was 14 and small for it, and who came to the door of the officer's anteroom one gray morning in the 3rd week of autumn with his cap twisted in both hands and his courage clearly costing him everything he had. The footman tried to turn him back, for boys of the stable do not knock on that door, and I heard the low argument through the wall and came out to see what the trouble was. Pell looked up at me. I was in my service coat, the braid on the cuff, the look of a man not to be bothered with stable matters, and he forgot every word he had rehearsed and simply said the thing that was in him. Sir, the old horse is dying, and I think he wants to hear the band. I will not pretend I understood at once. I asked him to explain himself, and he did badly, the way the young do when a thing matters too much to be said in order. He told me Sorrel would not eat. He told me the horse stood at the rail of his paddock from the first light, his blind face lifted and turned toward the south, toward the long avenue and the band school beyond it, and that he stood so until dark, and that nothing the boy did would settle him. And then Pell told me the thing that stopped me, because he had clearly thought about it for a long time before he dared to come and say it. He's not listening for me, sir, the boy said. He's listening for the music. He marched to it 19 years. He doesn't know why it stopped. He thinks he's been left out of the line. I sent the boy back to the stables and told him I would consider it, which is what officers say when they mean to do nothing, and I sat down at my desk and could not work. I have stood at a great many solemn things in my life. I have stood the vigil at the lying-in state of an old king of our house. I have carried a fallen comrade to his grave with the slow march and the reversed arms. I know what it is to give a thing its due. But I had never once thought about what it costs an animal to be retired from the only purpose it has ever known, and to be left in a green field in silence, and to spend its last days with its face turned toward a sound that has gone out of the world. I went to see the horse that afternoon. The paddock behind the riding school is a plain square of turf with a white rail, and the old charger was standing at the southern corner of it when I came, exactly as the boy had said, his head up and slightly tilted, his ears working forward and back, hunting the air. He was a big horse still, deep through the chest, dappled gray gone almost white with his years, and he wore his age the way old soldiers wear it, in the slowness of his movements and the dignity that the slowness gave them. His eyes, when I came near, were 2 pale clouded moons that did not find me, but his ears found me. They swung toward my footfall on the grass and held there, reading me, and when I stopped at the rail he turned his great blind head and put it over the top bar and breathed at me, long and slow, taking the measure of a stranger. I had brought a heel of bread from the mess, the way one does. He took it from my flat hand with a gentleness that undid something in my chest, and then, having eaten it, he did not turn away. He stood with his face close to mine, his blind eyes pointed somewhere past my shoulder, and his ears went on hunting the south wind, and I understood the boy had told me nothing but the truth. The horse was waiting. He had been waiting for 2 years. He was waiting for the band. I went back to my quarters, and I did not sleep well, and in the morning I went to the colonel. I will say plainly that this was not a small thing to ask. The regimental band of the household does not play for horses. It plays for the king, for the trooping of the standard, for the state arrivals and the great funerals of the house, and its hours are written into the orders of the week a season in advance. To assemble 24 bandsmen on a clear morning, on the closed parade ground, with no royal occasion to warrant it, for the sake of one blind old animal who could not even be made to understand why the music had come, I knew exactly how it would sound when I said it aloud. I said it aloud anyway. I stood in the colonel's office with my cap under my arm, and I told him about the boy, and the horse, and the face turned south, and I asked him for the band and the parade ground for 1/2 of one morning. The colonel was a hard old man with a reputation for refusing things, and he looked at me for a long moment across his desk, and I prepared myself to be refused. "You're asking me," he said slowly, "to turn out the king's own band for a horse." "I am, sir," I said. "You know how that will look." "I do, sir." He stood and went to the window and looked out at the gray courtyard for what felt like a long time. And when he turned back to me, his face had changed in a way I had not expected, and his voice was lower than I had ever heard it. "That horse," he said, "carried the standard at my own first trooping 30 years ago when I was a cornet and could not keep my seat in the rain. He stood like a wall under the guns at the king's last salute. He has given this regiment more years of faithful service than half the men who will laugh at you for asking." He came back and sat heavily down. "You'll have the band. You'll have the ground. You'll have it done properly or not at all, full dress, the standard out, the whole troop to attend. If this regiment is going to thank an old soldier, it will thank him the way it thanks any other. On the square in the colors, with the music he marched to. See to it." I did not trust myself to speak. I saluted, and I went out, and I stood in the corridor for a moment with my hand against the cold stone of the wall, because I had come in to beg a small private kindness, and I was walking out with a regimental honor, and the difference between those two things was the whole of what I had failed to understand the day before. We set it for the following Thursday, an hour after the morning watch, on the great parade ground within the walls, the wide stone square where the troop drills, ringed by the old gray buildings of the barracks, open to the sky. I gave the boy Pell the task of preparing the horse, which was a kindness to the boy as much as to the animal, and I went to the bandmaster myself rather than send the order down the usual way, because I did not want it to arrive as a duty. I wanted it to arrive as what it was. The bandmaster was a precise man named Ashford, who had served 31 years and had a horror of anything sentimental, and I watched his face carefully as I explained what I wanted and why. I expected him to be cool about it. I have known many fine soldiers who keep a hard rind over a soft thing, and Ashford was one of them. When I had finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked me one question. "What did he march to, the old horse? Do we know the piece?" I had not thought to find out, but Pell knew. When I sent for the boy, he answered without hesitation, because he had heard the old troopers talk of it 100 times in the tack room. The mounted troop of Brentsmark had a march of its own, an old slow piece in 3-time called the Long Avenue, written generations back for the pace of the great horses going up the King's Mile, and it was that march, and no other, that Sorrel had carried the standard to for 19 years. The band still knew it. They played it perhaps twice a year now, on the high ceremonial days, and the old horse, blind in his paddock, his face turned south, had not heard it since the spring his eyes went dark. "The Long Avenue," Ashford said, and something moved behind his precise gray face. "I'll have them note perfect. He'll not hear a wrong bar from my band on his last morning. You have my word on it." That, I think, was the moment I understood the thing would be larger than I had planned. I had asked for a kindness, but a regiment is a body of men who have given their lives to the idea that service is honored, that the faithful are not forgotten, that a soldier who has done his duty is owed the full weight of his colors at the end. And once that idea was let loose among them, on behalf of an old horse who had served as faithfully as any of them, it could not be made small again. It went through the barracks in a single day. By Wednesday night every man in the regiment knew, and not one of them laughed. What I had not foreseen was the trouble in the boy. I came down to the stables on Wednesday evening to see how the preparation went, and I found Pell in the old horse's box in a state I will not soon forget. He had cleaned and oiled the great saddle that Sorrel had not worn in 2 years, and he had laid out the standard carrier's dress, and he had brushed the dappled gray coat until it shone like pewter. And then his nerve had failed him utterly, and he was sitting in the straw with his back against the wall and his face in his hands, and the horse was standing over him with his blind head lowered, breathing into the boy's hair. "What's this?" I said, more gruffly than I meant to. Pell scrambled up, scrubbing at his face. "Sir, I'm sorry, sir." "Tell me what's wrong, lad." It came out of him in a rush, and it was not what I expected, and it shamed me a little, because it was the question I should have asked myself at the very start and had not. What if it didn't work? What if they brought the old blind horse all that way to the square in his colors, with the whole troop watching and the band assembled, and the music played, and the horse felt nothing? What if Sorrow was simply old and tired and ready to be done, and the music meant nothing to him at all, and they had dressed an animal up and stood him in front of the regiment for a thing he could not even know was happening? "Then it'd be us, sir," the boy said miserably. "Then it'd be us doing it because it made us feel better and not him, and he's tired, sir. He's so tired. Maybe he just wants to be left be." I sat down on the upturned bucket by the door, which is not a thing officers do, and I looked at the boy for a while, and then I looked at the horse, who had lifted his head again at the sound of my voice and turned his blind face toward the south even here in the closed box, hunting the air out of pure long habit. "Look at his ears," I said. The boy looked. "He's been doing that 2 years," I said. "You told me so yourself. He stands at the rail from first light with his face turned south, listening for a thing that doesn't come. That's not a horse who's ready to be done, son. That's a horse who knows he's been left out of the line and can't understand why, and is too faithful to stop waiting. We're not dressing him up for ourselves. We're answering him. He's been asking the same question for 2 years every morning out loud with that face turned south, and on Thursday, for the first time, somebody's going to answer it." I stood. "Whether he lifts his head or not is not for us to decide, and it's not the measure of whether we were right," he asked. "We answer. That's the whole of it. That's what the regiment is for." I am not certain the boy believed me. I am not entirely certain I believed myself. But he stopped crying, and he went back to the brushing, and the old horse stood over him patient in the lamplight, and I went up to my quarters and lay awake a second night. Thursday came in clear and cold and very still. There had been a frost, and the great stone square within the walls was silvered with it when I came out at first light, and the old gray barrack building stood around it sharp and quiet against a sky going from gray to a thin gold in the east. I had given orders that the ground was to be kept closed, no public, no fuss, only the regiment, but I had not been able to keep word from spreading beyond the walls, and as the morning came on I saw faces in the high windows of the buildings that ringed the square, the wives and children of the married quarters, the cooks and the grooms and the clerks, every soul of that small closed world drawn quiet to a window to watch a thing they had heard of and could hardly believe was being done. The band came out at the appointed hour and formed up at the southern end of the square, in their full dress, the brass of their instruments catching the new sun. Ashford set them with the care of a man laying out something sacred. The troop assembled along the eastern side, dismounted in their colors, 200 men in red and gold standing easy in their ranks with their bearskins on and their faces forward. And I will tell you that I have inspected that troop on the king's own birthday, and never seen it turned out finer than it was that frost-bright morning for the sake of a horse who could not see it. And the standard came out. I had not been sure the colonel meant it when he said the standard would attend, for the standard does not leave its place but for the king and the gravest occasions of the house. But he had meant it. The young cornet who carried it now came onto the square at the slow march, the great embroidered color of the household horse lifting and settling in the cold air, and he took his post at the head of the eastern rank exactly where the standard rides at the trooping, exactly where, for 19 years, the old gray charger had carried it. The men's eyes went to it and then forward again. The whole square seemed to draw a breath and hold it. Then they brought the horse. Pell led him in through the western archway at a walk, on a long loose rein, and the old gray charger came onto the frosted square with his blind head high and his ears already working, hunting the strange new air of a place he had not stood in for 2 years. I had wondered whether he would know it. A blind animal knows the world by its ears and its nose and the feel of the ground under it, and the square gave him all three at once. The ring of his own shod hooves coming back off the stone, the smell of 200 men and their leather and their horses' history soaked into the cobbles, the wide cold openness of a place with sky over it and walls around it. I watched him take it in. I watched the great blind head lift higher and the nostrils flare and the ears stop their idle hunting and go still, both pricked hard forward, and I knew that something in him had recognized the ground beneath his feet. He had been on the King's Avenue. He knew he was back among soldiers. The men's discipline held, but I saw it cost them. Old troopers who had served beside this horse for half their lives stood in the eastern rank with their faces forward and their jaws set, and the frost did not entirely account for the brightness in their eyes. The horse came down the center of the square at the boy's shoulder, slow and stately, his blind face turning this way and that to read the silence, for it was a vast silence, 200 men and a whole barracks of watching faces, and not one sound but the old gray hooves striking the frosted stone. And he carried himself, I swear it, the way he must have carried himself up the avenue in his prime, head up, neck arched, every faithful old line of him remembering what he was for. Pell brought him to the center of the square and halted him, facing the band, and stood at his head with the rein loose in his hand and his small face white as the frost. The horse stood. His ears worked the silence. And nothing happened, and nothing happened, and I felt the whole square begin to lean toward the awful possibility the boy had wept about the night before, that we had brought him all this way and dressed him in his colors, and the music would mean nothing, and he would only be a tired old blind animal standing, confused on cold stone in front of men who had wanted too badly to give him something he could no longer receive. I looked at Ashford, Ashford looked at me, and I gave the small nod. He raised his hand. He held it a moment, the whole band watching it, the whole square watching it, the old horse standing blind and patient at the center of all of it with his face turned toward the brass he could not see. And then Ashford's hand came down, and the band began to play the long avenue. I have heard that march all my service. I have heard it at the trooping with the sun on the standard, and 10,000 of the public lining the King's Mile. I had never once heard it the way I heard it that frost-bright morning on the closed square, played note perfect and slow and tender by 30 men who had each privately decided that they would not give an old soldier a single wrong bar on his last morning, and I had never once watched it land the way it landed then. The first low notes went out across the square, and the old blind horse came alive. I do not know how else to say it. The change went through him from his ears to his hooves in the space of a single bar. His head, already high, came higher, and the long arch of his neck drew up and proud the way it must have drawn up under the standard 1,000 mornings, and his blind clouded eyes, which had not found my face at the rail, which had not found the bread in my hand until he smelled it. His blind eyes opened wide and turned toward the band as though the music were a thing he could see, as though after 2 years of darkness somebody had finally lit a lamp in the world and pointed him at it. His ears stood hard forward, locked on the brass. A long shiver went down the whole gray length of him. And then the old charger of the household horse, 29 years old and blind in both eyes and 2 years, retired into silence, lifted one forefoot off the frosted stone, and set it down again on the beat of the march. On the beat, exactly on the beat. Pell made a sound beside him that was half a sob and half a laugh, and the boy clapped a hand over his own mouth to keep his discipline, and I saw the rein go slack in his other hand, because the horse no longer needed leading. The horse had found the line. 19 years that march had lived in his old bones, in the nerve and the muscle and the deep horse memory below all seeing, and the moment the brass called him, he answered it the only way a soldier of his years and his service knew how to answer. He came to attention. He squared himself to the band. He stood blind and tall in the center of the frosted square with his ruined eyes turned toward the music and his great heart beating against his ribs, and he lifted his head to the regiment that had not forgotten him, and he held it there, and he was not a tired old animal waiting to be done. He was the standard horse of Brentsmark, home in the colors, back in the line, answered at last. I have stood at solemn things, as I have said. I have learned to keep my face. I kept it that morning, because an officer must, and because the men were watching, and because the worst thing I could have done to the dignity of the moment was to let it become about me. But I will tell you that I have never in my life had to work so hard at the keeping, and I was not alone in it. All down the eastern rank, 200 disciplined men stood at attention with their faces forward and the tears standing in their eyes and not falling, because falling is not the discipline. Holding is the discipline, and they held, the way they had held under the guns and at the gravesides and through every hard thing the service had ever asked of them. They held now for the old horse, and gave him the one gift a regiment can give, which is the gift of their whole attention, undivided, for as long as the music lasted. The horse listened. That is the thing I will carry to my own grave, the look of him listening. Whatever a horse can feel, whatever runs in them below the place where our words can reach, it ran in him then, and it filled him up and it lifted him, and his blind face followed the rise and fall of the march as if he were reading it off the air. And once, I would not believe it if I had not seen it. Once, in the long swelling middle of the piece where the great horses used to wheel into the avenue, the old charger gathered himself and took 3 slow, stately steps forward, in time, in perfect time. His ruined eyes turned to the brass, marching the way he had marched for 19 years, until Pell with the tears running freely down his face now, and his discipline gone entirely, laid a gentle hand on the gray neck, and the old horse stopped, content. Having marched his 3 steps, having answered the call, having shown them all that he remembered, that he had always remembered, that he had been ready every morning for 2 years for exactly this and only this. Ashford brought the band down softly at the end, the way you lower something you do not want to wake. The last low note of the long avenue went out across the frosted square and faded against the old gray walls and was gone, and the silence that came after it was the largest silence I have ever stood inside. The horse stood in the center of it with his head still high, his ears still forward, waiting. And when no more music came, he did not droop, he did not sag back into the tired, blind animal of the paddock. He held his proud old head up and turned his face slowly along the eastern rank, from man to man down the whole length of the troop, his blind eyes passing over each of them as though he were taking the salute, as though he knew exactly who stood there and why, as though he were telling them, the only way he could, that he had heard them, that the answer had reached him, that he was content. And then the colonel did a thing I had not been told he would do, and that no order of mine had arranged, and that I have thought about every day since. He came out onto the square. The hard old man who refused things, who had told me how it would look to turn out the king's band for a horse. He came out alone from the western archway in his full dress with his sword at his side, and he walked the length of the frosted ground to where the old gray charger stood with his head high, and his face turned along the line. And the colonel stopped in front of the horse, and he stood to attention before him, this old soldier before that old soldier, and he raised his white-gloved hand to the brim of his cap, and he saluted him. He held the salute. He held it the full count, the way you hold it for the standard, the way you hold it for the king, the way you hold it for the fallen carried past with the slow march and the reversed arms. He gave the old blind horse of the household the full honor of his hand, in front of the whole regiment, in front of the watching windows, and there was not a man on that square who did not understand that what they were watching was not a sentimental thing got up to make them feel better, but a debt, a true debt of honor, owed by the regiment to one of its own who had served it faithfully for 19 years and asked for nothing, and was being paid now in full on the square in the colors. With the music he marched to, exactly as the colonel had said it must be done if it was done at all. The horse could not see the salute, but I will tell you that his ears found the small sound of the colonel's heels coming together, and his blind head turned and lowered, and he put his great gray face down toward the old man and breathed at him, long and slow, taking his measure the way he had taken mine at the rail. And the colonel, holding his salute, let the old horse breathe against his white glove, and something passed between the two of them in that frozen moment that I do not have the words for and will not insult by trying to find them. Two old soldiers at the end of their long service, meeting on the square one last time. That is all. That is everything. When the colonel brought his hand down at last, the spell on the square broke very gently, the way a held breath is let go, and the morning went on. There was no command given to dismiss. The men simply stood a while longer in their ranks, unwilling to be the first to move and end the thing. The boy Pell turned the old horse and led him slowly back toward the western archway, and the troop, every man of it, came to attention without an order as the horse passed down the line, 200 men stiffening of their own accord and turning their eyes to him, giving him the line one last time, all the way to the arch. Sorrow walked at head high, his blind face lifted, and at the very edge of the square, just before the boy led him through and out of sight, the old charger stopped of his own will and turned his ruined eyes back toward where the band had stood and where the standard hung in the cold gold light, and he held there a moment, listening, as though waiting to be certain the music was truly finished. And then, satisfied, he lowered his head and let the boy lead him home. I went down to the stables that evening, as I had every evening that week, and I found the old horse changed. The restlessness had gone out of him. He was not standing at the southern rail of his box with his face turned and hunting the air. He was lying down in the deep clean straw, which a horse of his years did not often do, and he had his nose tucked round toward his own flank, and he was at peace in a way I had not seen in him before. Pell sat in the straw beside him with the old gray head half in his lap, and the boy looked up at me when I came to the door, and there was no grief in his face any more, only a kind of quiet wonder. "He ate, sir," the boy said. "First time proper in a fortnight. He ate and he drank and he let me brush him and he hasn't gone to the rail once. He's not waiting any more, sir." Pell stroked the great clouded face and the old horse breathed slow and easy under his hand. He heard it. He knows he wasn't left out of the line. He just wanted to know he wasn't forgotten. The boy looked down at the horse. "He's not waiting for anything now." I have thought a great deal in the time since about what that boy understood at 14 that I had served 30 years without understanding. We tell ourselves in the regiment that discipline is the whole of the thing, that the highest soldier is the one who can stand the longest and feel the least, that to hold the face and keep the line and never break is the sum of a man's service. And there is truth in it. God knows there is truth in it. The line is held by men who do not break. But the old horse taught me on that frost-bright morning the other half of the truth, the half the boy had known all along. A man does not give his whole life to faithful service so that he can be forgotten in a green field with his face turned toward a sound that has gone out of the world. He gives it because he believes the service is true, that the faithful are honored, that the duty is owed both ways, that a soldier who has done all that was asked of him will not, at the end, be left out of the line. The discipline is the holding. but the honor is the answering. And a regiment that can hold the line but cannot answer its own faithful when they stand blind and waiting at the rail has kept only the smaller half of what it swore. The old horse lived 11 days more. They were good days, the boy told me, and I believe him, for I went down most evenings and saw it myself. The waiting had left the old charger entirely. He ate well and he stood easy, and he let the stable cat sleep against his warm flank in the cold nights, and when Pell led him out to the paddock each morning, he no longer went to the southern rail to hunt the air for a music that would not come. He had heard it. He stood instead in the middle of his green square with the boy, and dozed in what thin autumn sun there was, and was content. On the 11th night the boy came up himself to the officers' quarters, which boys of the stable do not do, and stood at the door with his cap in his hands again, and this time he did not have to say very much. The old horse had lain down in the straw at evening, the boy said, and had not got up, and had gone very quietly in the night with his nose tucked round to his flank and the cats against his side, in no distress at all, as if he had simply decided that the thing was finished and he might at last put it down. I went down. I stood a long while in the box in the lamplight with the great still gray shape in the straw and the boy weeping quietly in the corner, and I will not write here what I felt, because some things are kept and not spoken, and that is its own kind of discipline. But I will write what we did, because the doing of it is the end of this account and the whole point of it. We did not let him become a number in a ledger. The colonel saw to that, as he had seen to everything. The old standard horse of the household was buried with honor in the green paddock behind the riding school where he had spent his last years, in the southern corner where he had stood so long with his face turned toward the avenue. And the regiment turned out for it, not in the press of duty, but every man who could be spared and many who could not. And the band came again and played the long avenue one last time, slow and tender and note perfect. Over the grave of the horse who had marched to it for 19 years, the colonel said a few plain words. There was a stone set there afterward, a low gray stone, and on it was cut his name and his years, and beneath them one line that the colonel himself chose, and that I think of more often than I think of almost anything else I have known in the service. He carried the colors. We did not forget him. The boy Pell is a man now, and a fine groom of the household horse, and he tells the story to the young ones who come up green to the stables, the way the old troopers used to tell their stories in the tack room. He tells them about the blind old charger who stood at the southern rail for 2 years with his face turned toward a music that had gone out of the world, and how a whole regiment turned out one frost-bright morning to answer him, and how the old horse heard the first low notes of his march and came alive and lifted his head and marched his 3 slow steps in perfect time, blind and 29 and home at last in the colors. The young ones do not always understand it, the first time they hear it. They are young, and they think the service is the standing still and the holding the face and the never breaking, the way I once thought it. But Pell tells them anyway, the way you plant a thing that will not grow until long after you have walked away, because one frost-bright morning when they are older and have stood at their own solemn things, it will come back to them, and they will understand. The strength was never only in the not moving. Any post can stand still. The strength, the honor, the whole of what we are for, was in knowing that the old soldier at the rail was still asking his faithful question, every morning into the silence, and in being the regiment that walked out onto the cold square and answered it, in the colors, with the music he marched to, so that a blind old horse at the end of his long service could lift his head one last time to the band, and know, before he laid it down, that he had never once been forgotten.